August 18, 1966, Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. The humidity hung at 95% as Major Rod Sandover's five-man Australian SAS patrol lay motionless in knee-high scrub, 18 kilometers north of Nui Dat. Above them, triple canopy jungle blocked out the sun at 80 to 120 feet. The silence was absolute. No radio chatter, no engine noise, no movement that might betray their position to the 70 Viet Cong fighters moving single file along the narrow trail just meters away. This was how the war was supposed to work. Massive American firepower would crush the enemy through overwhelming force. Helicopter gunships, artillery barrages, search and destroy missions with thousands of troops. The Viet Cong had learned to fade away from American strength, then emerge when the dust settled. But as the enemy column passed within arm's reach of the hidden Australians, close enough to hear whispered conversations, close enough to smell cigarette smoke, something was different. No warning, no sound, no sign these phantoms existed. Later, captured documents would reveal what the Viet Cong called them, Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. The enemy had encountered soldiers who hunted like they did, but with a precision that would drive them to hatred more intense than they felt for any American unit. The patrol had been moving for 36 hours through terrain that defied every principle of conventional warfare, where visibility dropped to arm's length and sound carried unpredictably through layers of vegetation that rose like cathedral walls toward an invisible sky. Major Rod Sandover checked his watch, 0615 hours, then studied the faces of his four companions through the green filtered light that managed to penetrate the canopy. Each man carried identical equipment, an M16A1 rifle with 240 rounds of ammunition, a PRC-25 radio weighing 23 pounds, water for 48 hours, and nothing else that might create noise, reflection, or scent signatures detectable by an enemy who had turned this jungle into a weapon against every Western force that had entered it. The Australian approach to reconnaissance differed fundamentally from American doctrine in ways that would prove decisive in the months to come. Where U.S. long-range reconnaissance patrols typically operated with 8 to 12 men carrying heavier weapons and support equipment, the SAS had refined their tactics through decades of jungle warfare in Malaya, understanding that invisibility mattered more than firepower when operating deep in enemy territory. Their movement rate of 100 to 200 meters per hour seemed glacially slow compared to American mechanized operations, but it allowed them to pass through areas where larger forces would trigger immediate enemy response. Sandover's team represented something new in the Vietnam War, soldiers trained to think like their guerrilla opponents while maintaining the discipline and coordination of elite conventional forces. Their insertion the previous night had been conducted using techniques borrowed from special operations in Southeast Asia, where silence could mean the difference between mission success and complete annihilation. The UH-1H Iroquois helicopter had approached at 80 knots with landing lights extinguished, touched down for fewer than 10 seconds, and departed immediately while the five-man patrol melted into vegetation so dense that thermal imaging would have difficulty detecting body heat through the layered canopy. The first indication of the enemy presence came at 0647 hours, when Trooper John Whiston, positioned as forward scout 20 meters ahead of the main patrol, raised his closed fist in the signal for immediate halt. His reputation within 2 Squadron was built on an almost supernatural ability to read jungle sign, disturbed leaves, broken twigs, soil compression patterns that revealed human passage hours or even days after the fact. What he had detected this morning was something more immediate and dangerous, the sound of multiple personnel moving along a trail system that intelligence reports had marked as a possible supply route for D445 Battalion. Whiston's hand signals conveyed information with precision that eliminated any need for radio communication that might betray their position. 70 to 90 personnel moving south along the main trail. Mixed equipment, including what appeared to be heavy weapons based on the distinctive sound signatures of metal components striking against load-bearing gear. Movement discipline consistent with veteran fighters who understood the importance of noise control, but were not expecting enemy contact in an area they considered secure. Sandover faced a decision that would define the fundamental difference between Australian and American approaches to reconnaissance warfare. Standard U.S. doctrine called for immediate engagement of targets of opportunity, using superior firepower to inflict maximum casualties before calling for extraction and artillery support. The SAS philosophy emphasized intelligence gathering over body count, understanding that information about enemy capabilities and intentions could prove more valuable than tactical victories that revealed friendly capabilities to surviving enemy forces. The patrol commander made his choice with the calm deliberation that had made him legendary within the regiment. Using hand signals that had been refined through years of training, he directed his team into overwatch positions that provided maximum concealment while maintaining visual contact with the enemy formation. Each man understood his role without verbal communication: observe, record, report, and prepare for contact only if the patrol was compromised or if an opportunity presented itself to eliminate high-value targets without revealing the team's presence. What followed demonstrated why Vietnamese forces would develop such intense hatred for Australian reconnaissance operations. The SAS patrol observed the enemy column for 47 minutes, recording details about unit composition, equipment, movement patterns, and leadership structure that would prove invaluable for future operations. Most importantly, they identified what appeared to be a battalion-level commander based on his position within the formation, the deference shown by subordinates, and the communications equipment carried by his security detail. Sandover's salute report, size, activity, location, unit, time, equipment, was transmitted to 1st Australian Task Force headquarters in under 90 seconds using brevity codes that compressed detailed tactical intelligence into brief radio bursts virtually indistinguishable from atmospheric static. The response was immediate and devastating. 103 Field Batteries 105 L5 pack. Howitzers, positioned 10 kilometers away at Nui Dat, fired a precision registration mission that bracketed the enemy formation with high explosive rounds timed to detonate at optimal height above the jungle canopy. The artillery strike demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of combining Australian reconnaissance capabilities with supporting fires coordinated through superior communications technology. The enemy column, which had been moving with the confidence of forces operating in secure territory, found itself under accurate artillery fire delivered by weapons they could not see, directed by observers they did not know existed, coordinated through communications networks they could not intercept or jam. But the true measure of the SAS patrol's success came in what happened after the artillery barrage ended. While surviving enemy personnel attempted to reorganize their scattered formation and evacuate casualties, Sandover's team remained in position to observe the immediate aftermath and gather intelligence about enemy response procedures. What they witnessed provided crucial insights into command structure, medical capabilities, communication protocols, and tactical doctrine that would inform future operations throughout Phuoc Toi Province. The extraction phase of the operation demonstrated why Australian forces had developed such a fearsome reputation among enemy intelligence personnel who attempted to track their movements. Rather than calling for immediate helicopter pickup that would reveal their position and compromise future operations in the area, the patrol initiated a carefully planned withdrawal through terrain they had reconnoitered during their insertion. Their movement was so carefully controlled that they left virtually no trace of their passage, following techniques that ensured pursuing forces would find no indication of direction, strength, or destination. When the UH-1H finally arrived for extraction 6 hours later, it touched down at a landing zone 3 kilometers from the original contact site, selected to prevent enemy forces from correlating the helicopter's arrival with the morning's artillery strike. The pickup itself lasted fewer than 15 seconds, with the patrol disappearing into the aircraft so quickly that ground observers would have difficulty determining how many personnel had been extracted or what equipment they had carried. Intelligence analysis of the operation revealed its strategic significance beyond the immediate tactical results. Radio intercepts indicated that the enemy formation had been carrying documents and personnel en route to a major planning conference, and the artillery strike had eliminated key staff officers whose loss would disrupt operations throughout the province for weeks. More importantly, the psychological impact of the attack would force enemy commanders to divert precious resources to counter reconnaissance operations designed to locate and eliminate the invisible teams that had demonstrated the ability to call down destruction without warning. Most significantly, captured documents recovered weeks later contained the first references to what Vietnamese forces had begun calling the Australian reconnaissance teams, Ma Rung, the Phantoms of the Jungle. These were veteran fighters who had survived years of combat against American forces without losing confidence in their ability to control the battlefield through superior knowledge of local terrain and support from civilian populations. But they had encountered something new and terrifying. Soldiers who could move through their territory undetected, observe their operations without being seen, and coordinate lethal response from weapons and support elements the enemy could not locate or counter. The operation established a template for Australian reconnaissance warfare that would be replicated hundreds of times over the next 5 years, each mission adding to the psychological pressure that would eventually make SAS patrols the most feared enemy formation operating in South Vietnam. They had proven that small teams of properly trained soldiers could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to their numbers by combining stealth, patience, precision, and coordinated fires in ways that conventional forces could not match or counter. By late 1966, the contrast between Australian and American operational philosophies had crystallized into something approaching a philosophical divide that would define the remainder of the war. The first Australian task force had established its base at Nui Dat, a rubber plantation complex that provided both tactical advantages and symbolic significance in a conflict where perception often mattered more than reality. The 24-kilometer tactical area of responsibility assigned to Australian forces was perfectly suited for small unit reconnaissance operations. Dense jungle canopy that defeated aerial observation, interlocking trail networks that channeled enemy movement into predictable patterns, and terrain, features that provided concealment for teams willing to move with patience and discipline. The American approach to Vietnam had been shaped by institutional experiences in World War II and Korea, where overwhelming firepower and rapid maneuver had achieved decisive victories against conventional enemies who fought according to recognizable tactical doctrine. Their long-range reconnaissance patrols typically operated with 8 to 12 personnel carrying M60 machine guns, M79 grenade launchers, and communication equipment designed to coordinate immediate air support and artillery strikes. The philosophy emphasized maximum firepower at the point of contact, with extraction procedures that relied on helicopter gunships and fast-moving reaction forces to overwhelm enemy resistance through superior technology and coordination. Major Sandover understood that his regiment's approach represented something fundamentally different, rooted in decades of experience fighting communist insurgents in Malaya, where terrain and enemy tactics had demanded innovations that challenged conventional military thinking. Australian SAS teams operated with 4 to 6 personnel, carrying only essential equipment, moving at rates that seemed impossibly slow to officers trained in mechanized warfare, but which allowed them to pass through enemy-controlled territory without detection. Their ambush discipline reflected an understanding that precision mattered more than volume of fire, with claymore mines positioned at 15 to 25 meters and small arms engagements limited to 3 to 5 round bursts aimed at confirmed high-value targets. The tactical differences produced measurably different results that would prove decisive in shaping enemy perceptions and responses throughout the conflict. American LRRP operations typically resulted in brief, intense firefights, followed by immediate extraction under cover of supporting fires, leaving enemy forces with clear evidence of friendly capabilities and tactical procedures. Australian patrols conducted what intelligence analysts would later describe as zero-signature operations, engaging enemy forces with such precision that survivors often could not determine the size, location, or equipment of the attacking force. Trooper John Whiston embodied the skills that made Australian reconnaissance so effective against an enemy that had adapted successfully to American tactical methods. His ability to detect sign, the subtle indicators of human passage that remained visible for hours or days after the fact, had been refined through training that emphasized observation over firepower, patience over speed. He could read disturbed vegetation, soil compression patterns, and scent signatures with accuracy that allowed his patrol to track enemy movements while remaining completely invisible to forces that had learned to detect and avoid conventional reconnaissance elements. The footprint discipline that characterized Australian operations reflected understanding that the jungle itself was a weapon that could be turned against careless forces regardless of their technological advantages. SAS personnel had been trained to move through dense vegetation using rolling foot placement that minimized ground disturbance, to conduct rest periods standing rather than sitting to avoid crushing vegetation, and to plan movement routes that utilized natural concealment rather than speed or convenience. These techniques reduced their movement rate to 100 to 200 meters per hour during tracking operations, but they allowed patrols to operate for days in areas where enemy forces believed themselves secure. The psychological impact of these operations became apparent through intelligence gathered from captured documents and prisoner interrogations that revealed growing concern among Vietnamese commanders about invisible reconnaissance teams that seemed to appear without warning. D445 Battalion, the primary Viet Cong force operating in Phuoc Tuy Province, began issuing tactical guidance that specifically addressed the threat posed by what they had begun calling elite Australian reconnaissance forces. Their operational notes, later translated by intelligence specialist Ernest Chamberlain, revealed detailed knowledge of Australian capabilities and growing frustration with conventional counter-reconnaissance methods. Vietnamese tactical adaptations included splitting large formations into smaller packets during dawn and dusk movement periods, when Australian patrols were most likely to be conducting observations. They added extra sentries to supply routes that intelligence indicated had been compromised by reconnaissance teams, and they shortened daily movement distances from 10 to 12 kilometers to 6 to 7 kilometers in areas where Australian activity had been detected. Most significantly, they began warning subordinate units to expect first contact to target command elements, a clear indication that they had studied Australian ambush tactics and understood the precision with which SAS teams selected their targets. But the enemy's adaptations also revealed the fundamental weakness in their strategic position. Every measure taken to counter Australian reconnaissance reduced their operational effectiveness and forced them to divert resources from offensive operations to defensive security measures. Nguyen Van Heep, commanding D445 Battalion throughout this period, found himself caught in an impossible tactical situation where the presence of invisible reconnaissance teams forced his forces to operate with security measures that dramatically reduced their mobility and effectiveness while providing no guarantee of protection against forces that seemed capable of appearing anywhere at any time. The most significant demonstration of the Australian advantage came during a night ambush conducted by Sergeant Jack Lewis and his mixed Australian-New Zealand team along a known supply route used by D445 Battalion to move heavy weapons and ammunition between base areas. The ambush site was selected through weeks of patient observation that identified a stream crossing where the trail narrowed to single-file passage, forcing enemy personnel to move slowly through a kill zone only 18 meters wide. The patrol had positioned claymore mines with precision that reflected intimate knowledge of fragmentation patterns and casualty effects, while individual firing positions were selected to provide overlapping fields of fire with multiple escape routes through terrain that had been reconnoitered extensively. The engagement itself lasted 12 seconds from initial detonation to final shot, but its effects would resonate through enemy formations for months afterward. The lead Viet Cong scout was illuminated only by moonlight filtering through the canopy 60 feet above, but the patrol held fire until heavy weapons porters entered the killing zone, demonstrating the discipline that separated professional soldiers from conventional forces operating under combat stress. When the ambush was triggered, the precision of the engagement left survivors describing an attack by soldiers they could not see and had not heard approaching. Intelligence analysis revealed that the psychological impact of such operations far exceeded their tactical significance in terms of casualties inflicted or equipment destroyed. Radio intercepts showed that enemy commanders were diverting increasing resources to counter-reconnaissance operations designed to locate and eliminate the invisible teams that had demonstrated the ability to strike without warning and disappear without trace. Medical reports indicated that surviving enemy personnel were showing signs of combat stress that exceeded levels typically associated with conventional engagements, suggesting that the unpredictability and precision of Australian attacks was taking a psychological toll that conventional metrics could not measure. The tactical statistics that emerged from 18 months of Australian reconnaissance operations in Phuoc Tuy Province told a story that challenged every assumption about the relationship between force size and operational effectiveness. Approximately 1,200 SAS and New Zealand SAS patrols had produced 492 confirmed enemy killed in action, 106 possible kills, 47 wounded, and 11 captured, while suffering only 2 combat deaths. The kill ratio achieved by Australian forces was unmatched by any other Allied unit operating in Vietnam. But more importantly, the psychological impact of their operations had forced enemy forces to adopt defensive measures that reduced their operational effectiveness throughout the province. Most significantly, captured documents began referencing Australian forces in language that revealed genuine fear rather than mere tactical concern. Vietnamese commanders advised new personnel to study the methods used by elite Australian reconnaissance forces, warning that these units operated according to tactical principles that differed fundamentally from American doctrine and required different defensive measures. The emergence of the nickname Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle, in official enemy communications marked the point at which tactical success had achieved strategic significance by creating psychological effects that extended far beyond the immediate area of Australian operations. The tempo of operations intensified dramatically throughout 1968 and 69 as American forces surged in response to the Tet Offensive, creating opportunities for Australian reconnaissance teams to demonstrate capabilities that would fundamentally alter enemy perceptions of the tactical balance in Phuoc Tuy Province. Major Sandover's squadron was conducting 20 to 25 patrols per month, a rate of operations that pushed both personnel and equipment to their operational limits, while maintaining the precision and stealth that had made Australian forces so effective against an enemy that had learned to anticipate and counter conventional reconnaissance methods. The night insertion techniques developed during this period represented the pinnacle of helicopter-supported reconnaissance operations, combining technological capabilities with tactical innovation to achieve levels of stealth that seemed impossible to enemy observers who had grown accustomed to detecting American helicopter operations from kilometers away. UH-1H Iroquois helicopters approached landing zones at 65 to 80 knots with all external lighting extinguished, using only moonlight and starlight for navigation while maintaining radio silence that prevented enemy signals intelligence from detecting their approach until the aircraft were directly overhead. The final approach phase required coordination between aircrew and ground personnel that reflected months of training under conditions that simulated actual combat operations. Landing zones were selected not for convenience but for concealment, often in clearings barely large enough to accommodate the helicopter's rotor diameter, while providing escape routes through terrain that had been studied through aerial photography and previous reconnaissance missions. The aircraft would hover at minimum altitude for fewer than 30 seconds, while the 5-man patrol dispersed into jungles so dense that thermal imaging equipment would have difficulty detecting body heat signatures through the layered canopy. Sergeant Jack Lewis had refined these insertion procedures through dozens of missions that tested the limits of what small reconnaissance teams could accomplish in enemy-controlled territory. His mixed Australian-New Zealand patrol represented the evolution of Commonwealth Special Operations doctrine, combining decades of experience in Malaya with tactical innovations developed specifically for the unique challenges of the Vietnam conflict. The precision with which his teams conducted night ambushes reflected understanding that psychological warfare could be more decisive than conventional combat operations in achieving strategic objectives. The ambush site selected for what would become one of the most significant engagements of the war was located along a supply route that intelligence analysis had identified as critical to D445 Battalion's ability to maintain operations throughout the province. The trail crossed a small stream at a point where the water was shallow enough for personnel to wade across, but deep enough to slow movement and create noise that would mask the sounds of approaching patrol members. Most importantly, The crossing forced enemy personnel to move in single file through a killing zone that measured exactly 18 meters from the first concealment position to the final escape route. Lewis positioned his Claymore mines with precision that reflected intimate knowledge of fragmentation patterns and casualty effects, gained through extensive training and previous combat experience. Each mine was placed to maximize effectiveness against personnel moving along the trail while minimizing the risk of premature detonation from wildlife or environmental factors that might compromise the ambush. The overlap between adjacent mines ensured complete coverage of the killing zone, while individual firing positions were selected to provide clear fields of fire without creating crossfire situations that might endanger friendly personnel. The enemy formation that approached the ambush site shortly after midnight consisted of approximately 30 personnel carrying heavy weapons and ammunition that intelligence analysis indicated were destined for forward positions, preparing to engage Australian forces operating near Long Hai. The lead scout moved with the careful deliberation of a veteran fighter who understood the importance of detecting enemy presence before walking into prepared positions, but the stealth techniques employed by Lewis's patrol had rendered them completely invisible to conventional detection methods. The psychological discipline demonstrated by the patrol during the 43 minutes they observed the approaching enemy formation reflected training that emphasized mission accomplishment over immediate tactical gratification. Despite having clear shots at high-value targets, including what appeared to be a company-level commander, the patrol waited until heavy weapons porters entered the killing zone before initiating contact. This discipline ensured maximum tactical effect while maintaining the element of surprise that was crucial to successful extraction from deep enemy territory. When the ambush was triggered, the precision of the engagement exceeded anything enemy survivors had experienced in years of fighting American forces. The initial Claymore detonation eliminated the lead elements of the formation, while individual weapons fire engaged specific targets with 3 to 5 round bursts aimed at personnel carrying radios, heavy weapons, or other equipment that indicated leadership or specialist roles. The entire engagement lasted 12 seconds from first detonation to final shot, but the psychological impact on survivors would influence enemy tactical decisions for months afterward. Intelligence gathered from communications intercepts revealed that surviving enemy personnel described being attacked by soldiers they could not see and had not heard approaching, phantom forces that seemed to materialize from the jungle itself before disappearing without leaving any trace of their presence. Medical reports indicated casualty patterns that suggested the attacking force had possessed detailed knowledge of the enemy formation's composition and had deliberately targeted leadership and specialist personnel rather than engaging in the indiscriminate fire that characterized most night ambushes. But the true measure of the operation's success lay in the enemy's tactical response to what they perceived as an escalating threat from invisible reconnaissance forces that seemed capable of appearing anywhere at any time. Radio intercepts showed that D445 Battalion had begun implementing security measures that significantly reduced their operational effectiveness. Movement was restricted to smaller formations during daylight hours. Supply operations were suspended in areas where Australian activity had been detected, and precious personnel were diverted from offensive operations to counter-reconnaissance missions designed to locate and eliminate the phantom teams. Nguyen Van Heep found himself caught in an impossible tactical situation where the presence of Australian reconnaissance forces forced his battalion to operate with security measures that made effective offensive action nearly impossible. Intelligence analysis of captured documents revealed growing frustration among his subordinate commanders who were being asked to maintain aggressive operations while implementing defensive measures that assumed enemy reconnaissance teams could appear in any location at any time. The psychological pressure created by invisible adversaries was proving more effective than conventional military operations in degrading enemy capabilities. The most significant psychological breakthrough came when communications intelligence revealed that enemy forces had begun using the term Rung in official operational orders and tactical guidance distributed to subordinate units. The nickname Phantoms of the Jungle represented more than casual battlefield slang. It indicated that Australian reconnaissance forces had achieved a level of psychological dominance that affected enemy decision-making at the strategic level. Vietnamese commanders were planning operations around the assumed presence of invisible reconnaissance teams rather than treating them as an occasional tactical problem. Lieutenant Brian Scanlon's artillery support during this period demonstrated how technological superiority could be multiplied through tactical innovation to achieve effects that were disproportionate to the resources invested. His ability to convert SAS reconnaissance reports into accurate fire missions within 90 seconds had been refined through months of coordination with reconnaissance teams operating in terrain where traditional fire support coordination would have been impossible. The 105mm L5 pack howitzers under his control could deliver precision fires at ranges up to 10 kilometers, but their effectiveness depended entirely on reconnaissance teams that could provide accurate target location and damage assessment from positions that conventional forces could not reach or maintain. The psychological warfare campaign that emerged from these operations represented something new in modern conflict: the systematic use of stealth and precision to create psychological effects that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Enemy forces that had successfully adapted to American operational methods found themselves facing adversaries who seemed to possess supernatural abilities to appear and disappear at will while delivering lethal attacks with precision that defied conventional military logic. The fear generated by these phantom forces was more effective than massive bombing campaigns or large-scale ground operations in disrupting enemy capabilities and forcing defensive measures that reduced their operational effectiveness throughout the province. Most importantly, the success of Australian reconnaissance operations during this period established tactical principles that would influence special operations doctrine for decades to come. Small teams of highly trained soldiers operating with superior communications and fire support could achieve strategic effects that were impossible for conventional forces regardless of their numerical or technological advantages. The key lay not in overwhelming firepower, but in the ability to combine stealth, patience, precision, and coordinated support to create psychological pressure that forced enemy adaptation in ways that reduced their overall effectiveness. The monsoon season of 1970 brought environmental challenges that tested every aspect of SAS operational doctrine, creating conditions where even the most experienced reconnaissance teams found themselves operating at the margins of survivability. Humidity levels consistently exceeded 95%, causing equipment failures that could compromise entire missions, while ground-level winds dropped below 1 knot for days at a time, eliminating the air movement that normally helped mask the sounds and scents that might betray patrol positions to enemy tracking teams. It was under these conditions that Trooper John Whiston would face the moment that proved even phantoms could be detected by adversaries who possessed sufficient skill and patience. The 6-man patrol operating deep in the long high hills had been inserted 4 days earlier with a mission to observe and report on suspected enemy base areas that intelligence analysis indicated were being used to stage operations against Australian positions around Nui Dat. The terrain presented unique challenges even for operators trained in the most difficult jungle environments. Limestone karst formations created caverns and sinkholes that could hide entire companies, while vegetation patterns shifted unpredictably based on underground water sources that sustained different types of plant growth within meters of each other. Whiston's reputation within 2 Squadron was built on his ability to read environmental signs that other soldiers might miss entirely, but the conditions in the long high area pushed his skills beyond their normal limits. The combination of saturated air and minimal wind movement caused human scents to linger in areas where they would normally dissipate within minutes, creating olfactory signatures that experienced trackers could follow hours after a patrol had passed through. More importantly, the limestone substrate recorded footprints and equipment impressions with clarity that made track discipline exponentially more critical than in the softer soils that characterized most of Phuoc Toi province. The enemy tracking team that had been assigned to locate and eliminate Australian reconnaissance forces represented the evolution of Vietnamese tactical thinking in response to years of unsuccessful attempts to counter SAS operations through conventional methods. These were not ordinary infantry soldiers, but specialists trained specifically in counter-reconnaissance techniques, equipped with tracking skills that had been refined through generations of jungle warfare, and motivated by the kind of personal hatred that came from losing friends and comrades to invisible enemies who struck without warning. The first indication that the patrol had been compromised came when Whiston detected subtle changes in animal behavior patterns that suggested human presence in areas where his team had operated during the previous 48 hours. Birds that should have been calling were silent, while normal insect activity had been disrupted in ways that indicated recent human passage along routes the patrol had used during their approach to the observation position. Most critically, he identified scent signatures that suggested the presence of enemy personnel equipped with tracking dogs, animals whose olfactory capabilities could detect human presence hours after conventional tracking methods would have failed. The tactical situation that developed over the next 7 hours represented everything that SAS training was designed to prevent. A prolonged evasion through terrain that favored the pursuers over the pursued, conducted under environmental conditions that negated many of the advantages that normally allowed small reconnaissance teams to disappear at will. The patrol's movement rate dropped to fewer than 50 meters per hour as they attempted to move through areas where every footstep risked leaving sign that could be followed, while their ability to call for extraction was limited by dense canopy that prevented radio communication with supporting aircraft. Major Sandover monitored the situation from the Tactical Operations Center at Nui Dat, coordinating with helicopter crews who were standing by for immediate extraction, but who could not penetrate the canopy without creating landing zones that would require explosive charges and chainsaws. The weather conditions that had compromised the patrol's stealth were now preventing the rapid extraction procedures that had made previous SAS operations so successful. A UH-1H helicopter attempting to reach the patrol's position was forced to maintain altitude at 500 feet above ground level, far too high for safe rope insertion or extraction under combat conditions. The engagement that finally occurred demonstrated why Vietnamese forces had developed such hatred for Australian reconnaissance operations. When the tracking team finally made contact with Whiston's patrol, they expected to find soldiers who would either fight desperately from fixed positions or attempt to escape through terrain where superior numbers and local knowledge would ensure their capture or elimination. Instead, they encountered opponents who turned the pursuit into a series of carefully planned ambushes that inflicted casualties while maintaining the initiative despite being outnumbered and operating in unfavorable terrain. Whiston's wound came during the third contact, when the patrol was forced to cross an open area where limestone formations created natural choke points that could not be bypassed without exposing the team to observation from multiple directions. The enemy tracking team had anticipated this movement and positioned themselves to exploit the terrain advantage, but their tactical approach remained conventional in ways that Australian training had prepared for. The brief firefight that followed lasted less than 90 seconds, but it resulted in casualties on both sides that marked the first time an SAS patrol had been forced to leave wounded personnel on the battlefield. The psychological impact of drawing blood from the phantoms proved intoxicating to enemy forces who had spent years being hunted by invisible adversaries they could neither locate nor engage effectively. Radio intercepts revealed celebrations within D445 Battalion, as news spread that an Australian reconnaissance team had been forced to break contact and evacuate wounded personnel. Proof that the Ma Rung were not supernatural beings, but mortal soldiers who could be defeated through superior tactics and determination. But the enemy's celebration proved premature as the tactical situation continued to evolve in ways that demonstrated why Australian forces had become so feared throughout the province. Rather than accepting the loss of initiative that conventional military doctrine suggested should result from being wounded and pursued, Whiston's patrol began implementing evasion techniques that turned their apparent vulnerability into a tactical advantage. The wounded trooper's condition was stabilized through medical procedures that allowed continued movement, while the patrol's route was adjusted to lead pursuing forces through terrain that had been prepared for just such contingencies. The counter-ambush that followed represented the culmination of years of tactical evolution in small unit operations, demonstrating how properly trained soldiers could maintain offensive capability even under conditions that should have favored their opponents. The pursuing enemy force found itself channeled into a killing zone where the wounded patrol had positioned claymore mines and established overlapping fields of fire that negated their numerical advantage. The engagement lasted 43 seconds and resulted in 7 enemy killed in action before the survivors broke contact and withdrew. Intelligence analysis of communications intercepted during and after the engagement revealed the psychological complexity of the enemy's relationship with Australian forces. While the initial success in wounding an SAS trooper had generated genuine celebration, the subsequent reversal had created confusion and fear that exceeded the tactical significance of the casualties inflicted. Enemy commanders who had briefly believed they had found the key to defeating the Phantoms now faced the reality that wounded Australian soldiers were apparently more dangerous than healthy conventional forces. The extraction that finally occurred 18 hours later demonstrated the resilience and adaptability that characterized Australian special operations throughout the conflict. A UH-1H helicopter managed to reach the patrol's position by using a technique borrowed from medical evacuation procedures, hovering above the canopy while medics were lowered on ropes to stabilize the wounded trooper before the entire team was extracted using harnesses that allowed pickup without landing. The procedure required perfect coordination between aircrew and ground personnel under conditions where a single mistake could result in the loss of the entire patrol. The tactical lessons learned from this operation would influence SAS procedures for the remainder of the war, demonstrating that even the most successful tactical innovations could be countered by determined adversaries who possess sufficient skill and motivation. The enemy's success in tracking and engaging a patrol that had operated undetected for years represented an evolution in Vietnamese capabilities that forced corresponding adaptations in Australian tactics, equipment, and training procedures. Most importantly, the operation revealed the psychological foundation of the hatred that Vietnamese forces felt toward Australian reconnaissance teams. The brief moment when they believed they had achieved tactical superiority over the Phantoms had generated emotions that went far beyond normal military competition, reflecting years of accumulated frustration and fear that had been building since the first SAS patrols had begun operating in Phuoc Tuy province. When that moment of apparent victory was reversed through tactical innovations they had not anticipated, the resulting psychological impact proved more devastating than any conventional military defeat. The aftermath of the engagement was documented through communications intercepts that revealed D445 Battalion leadership warning subordinate units that wounding Australian soldiers did not reduce their combat effectiveness, but might actually increase their dangerous unpredictability. The Phantoms had demonstrated once again that they operated according to tactical principles that Vietnamese forces did not fully understand, making them more rather than less dangerous when circumstances seemed to favor their opponents. The withdrawal of Australian combat forces from Vietnam began on December 11, 1971, marking the end of an operational deployment that had fundamentally altered how modern warfare would be conducted for generations to come. Major Rod Sandover supervised the final equipment inventories with the methodical attention to detail that had characterized every aspect of SAS operations throughout 5 years of combat that had redefined the relationship between small elite units and strategic military objectives. The statistics compiled during the withdrawal process told only part of the story. Nearly 1,200 reconnaissance patrols conducted with a combat death toll of just 2 soldiers, while enemy casualties exceeded 800 confirmed killed in action. The true measure of Australian success lay not in casualty figures, but in the psychological transformation of enemy forces that had been documented through years of communications, intelligence, and prisoner interrogations. Vietnamese commanders who had once planned operations with confidence in their ability to control the battlefield through superior numbers and intimate knowledge of local terrain now operated under the assumption that invisible reconnaissance teams could appear at any location at any time. The Rung had achieved something that massive bombing campaigns and large-scale ground operations had failed to accomplish. They had forced fundamental changes in enemy tactical doctrine, based entirely on fear of capabilities they could not counter or predict. The final intelligence assessments painted a picture of enemy forces that had been systematically degraded, not through direct combat losses, but through the cumulative psychological pressure of fighting adversaries who seemed to possess supernatural abilities. Radio intercepts revealed that D445 Battalion had been reduced to fewer than 30% of its authorized strength, not through casualties inflicted in major engagements, but through the steady attrition of soldiers who had deserted rather than continue facing opponents. They had learned to fear more than death itself. Supply operations that had once moved hundreds of tons of equipment and ammunition through Phuoc Tuy province had been reduced to small-scale movements conducted under security measures, so restrictive that they barely maintained subsistence levels for remaining personnel. Trooper John Whiston's survival and recovery from his wounds had become a source of legend within enemy forces that revealed the complex psychology of soldiers who had learned to hate their opponents with intensity that exceeded normal military rivalry. Intelligence reports indicated that his ability to continue fighting effectively while wounded had been interpreted by enemy personnel as the evidence of superhuman capabilities that confirmed their worst fears about the nature of their Australian adversaries. The psychological impact of his recovery had actually increased enemy demoralization beyond what his death might have achieved, demonstrating that the Phantoms were not only invisible and deadly, but apparently indestructible as well. Sergeant Jack Lewis completed his final patrol on February 23, 1972, leading a mixed Australian-New Zealand team through areas that had once housed thousands of enemy fighters, but which intelligence analysis now indicated were virtually abandoned. The mission served as both reconnaissance and psychological warfare, demonstrating that SAS teams could still operate with impunity in terrain where enemy forces had once felt secure enough to establish permanent installations. The patrol encountered no enemy contact during 72 hours of movement through areas that should have been heavily defended, confirming intelligence assessments that organized resistance had effectively ceased throughout much of the province. The withdrawal procedures themselves reflected the psychological dominance that Australian forces had achieved through years of operations that had redefined enemy perceptions of what small military units could accomplish. Unlike American withdrawals that had been harassed by enemy forces seeking to inflict casualties on departing personnel, Australian movements were monitored but not engaged by Vietnamese forces who had learned through bitter experience that attacking SAS elements inevitably resulted in disproportionate casualties for the attackers. Intelligence intercepts revealed standing orders within remaining enemy units to observe but not engage Australian personnel during withdrawal operations, acknowledgement that even small Australian teams possessed capabilities that made direct confrontation inadvisable. Lieutenant Brian Scanlon's artillery support records documented the evolution of fire support coordination that had made Australian reconnaissance so devastatingly effective throughout the conflict. His ability to convert reconnaissance reports into accurate fire missions had been refined through hundreds of operations that demonstrated how superior communications and coordination could multiply the effectiveness of small reconnaissance teams beyond anything conventional military doctrine considered possible. The 105mm howitzers under his control had fired over 1,500 fire missions in support of SAS operations, achieving accuracy levels that exceeded peacetime training standards while operating under combat conditions that should have made such precision impossible. The tactical innovations developed during the Australian deployment would influence special operations doctrine throughout the Western military establishment for decades to come, establishing principles of small unit operations that emphasize stealth and precision over firepower and mass. Military academies would study SAS operations in Vietnam as examples of how properly trained and equipped elite forces could achieve strategic objectives that were beyond the capabilities of conventional units, regardless of their numerical or technological superiority. Most importantly, the psychological warfare techniques pioneered by Australian forces demonstrated that enemy morale and confidence could be more decisive targets than enemy personnel or equipment. Nguyen Van Heep's post-war testimonies, given during interviews conducted by Vietnamese military historians, revealed the lasting psychological impact of fighting opponents who had seemed to possess abilities that defied rational explanation. His descriptions of Australian reconnaissance teams used language typically reserved for supernatural phenomena, reflecting the genuine terror that had been generated by encounters with soldiers who appeared and disappeared at will while delivering lethal attacks with precision that seemed impossible for mortal adversaries. The hatred he expressed for Australian forces exceeded anything he felt toward American units, despite the vastly greater casualties inflicted by American firepower and bombing campaigns. The final operations conducted by Australian forces in Vietnam demonstrated the complete psychological collapse of organized enemy resistance in areas where SAS patrols had been most active. Intelligence reports indicated that former enemy base areas showed evidence of hasty abandonment without any attempt at systematic destruction of facilities or equipment that might have been useful to pursuing forces. Tunnel complexes that had once housed hundreds of fighters lay empty and partially collapsed, while supply caches contained equipment that had been abandoned rather than moved to more secure locations. The legacy that Australian forces left behind extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories achieved during their deployment. They had proven that modern warfare could be fundamentally altered by small numbers of highly trained soldiers operating according to principles that emphasized psychological pressure over physical destruction. The fear they had generated among enemy forces was based not on overwhelming firepower or superior numbers, but on capabilities that seemed to transcend normal military limitations. The ability to appear anywhere at any time, to observe without being seen, to strike without warning, and to disappear without leaving any trace of their presence. Radio intercepts during the final months of Australian operations revealed enemy communications that used the term Rung as synonymous with inevitable defeat, acknowledging that encounters with Phantom forces could not be won through conventional tactical methods. Vietnamese commanders advised subordinate units to avoid areas where Australian activity had been detected, effectively ceding control of vast areas of territory to forces that numbered fewer than 200 personnel at any given time. The psychological dominance achieved by Australian reconnaissance teams had created effects that were disproportionate to their numerical strength and completely contrary to conventional military wisdom about the relationship between force size and territorial control. The conclusion of Australian combat operations in Vietnam marked the end of a tactical experiment that had succeeded beyond anything its architects had imagined possible. Small teams of professional soldiers operating with superior training, equipment, and coordination had achieved strategic objectives that massive conventional forces had been unable to accomplish despite overwhelming advantages in firepower and numbers. The hatred that Vietnamese forces felt for Australian troops stemmed not from their casualties or equipment losses, but from their complete inability to develop effective countermeasures against adversaries who fought according to principles they could neither understand nor duplicate. The Phantoms of the Jungle had demonstrated that the future of warfare lay not in the application of overwhelming force, but in the precise application of specialized capabilities that could achieve psychological and strategic effects far beyond their tactical impact. They had proven that properly executed small unit operations could be more decisive than large-scale conventional campaigns in achieving long-term military objectives, establishing a template for special operations that would influence military thinking for generations to come.